Okay, well, yes, you're very welcome. My name's Louise Cullen. I'm BBC Northern Ireland's Agriculture and Environment Correspondent. I'm your chair for this Broken Spectre live panel event and looking after this esteemed panel today. So you're going to hear a little bit from each of them about what it is they do, and as Toby says, you'll have your opportunity to put questions at the end as well. An artist, a scientist, a conservationist and a journalist walk onto stage might sound like the beginning of a very bad joke, but there's actually quite a lot that ties everybody on this stage together, and we're going to explore some of that. Also interesting is just how connected all of us are to things that are happening thousands of miles away. Thanks to technology, transport, innovation, our individual worlds are both expanding and contracting remarkably. So, the clearance of hectares in the Amazonian rainforest might seem very, very distant, but actually it could indirectly be sitting on your dinner plate, depending what the cattle you're eating, if you're eating meat, what they were fed on to come to your plate from the farm a few miles up the road. And a rainforest may seem distant, but temperate rainforests once covered these islands. They now only remain in tiny scattered fragments and are frankly largely gone. And our peatlands too, of course, that's what this island in particular is well known for when you think of climate. But more than 80% of our peatlands are in poor condition. So let's talk about how Broken Spectre takes us to the Amazon and into ourselves, how scientists are learning ever more about our climate and what's happening to make this part of the world a fighter on the climate front. I'd like to introduce you to our panel. We have Richard Mosse, conceptual photographic artist and creator of Broken Spectre. We have Billy Hunter, senior marine chemist at the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute, and Simon Gray, the head of Peatland recovery at Ulster Wildlife. You've each got a couple of minutes, and as creator of Broken Spectre, Richard, you have the honour of going first. Tell us who you are.
Oh, thanks. Okay, good. Spirits. My name's Richard Mosse. I'm from County Kilkenny in Ireland. Grew up there, and I suppose I did my university mainly in London, and then went to Yale over in the United States, where I've been ever since in New York. Working based there, basically use it as an airport because I work a lot in the world. And I'm a documentary photographer as well as a contemporary artist, and those are very different things, and they have different powers, superpowers. But I'm trying to smash them together to create a new language, to try to move past and amplify the potential of photojournalism, which I find redundant, limited in a way. I'd like to extend that language. And I've worked in various places around the world, Eastern Congo, rare earth mineral extraction there, the refugee crisis across Middle East, North Africa and Europe, Iraq, embedded with the US Army there, worked a lot in Gaza and the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and post-war Balkan nations, and a lot of different places. And so in 2018 I went off to Ecuador, actually, to try to do a personal project to convalesce, literally, to relax. And I started taking pictures in the cloud forest of orchids and things. And so I became bonded with the rainforest at that point. And then Jair Bolsonaro was elected president in Brazil, and he was Captain Chainsaw and kicked off huge deforestation. And that's when I started to make my latest project, Broken Spectre.
Thank you very much. And Billy, tell us what you do. You're a biogeochemist, and tell us what that's all about.
So hi, I'm Billy Hunter. I'm a biogeochemist. It sounds like I couldn't make a decision at careers day at school. So I just thought I'd do everything. I'm interested in chemistry and the chemistry of the natural world. And essentially the biogeo side of that is bio, so the chemistry of life, and the geo is how that's spatially distributed around the planet. So I'm interested in how carbon, which we think about carbon dioxide as this gas in the atmosphere that causes global warming, but carbon is essentially the currency for all life. So carbon is your unit of energy transfer. All our bodies are made out of carbon, and it's what you're after when you eat. It's what makes up the sugar that your body burns. And I'm interested in how that carbon moves through the environment, and how we can better manage the movement of carbon through the environment to ultimately sort of balance human well-being against the risks around climate change. Because what we ultimately want to do is reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's up in the atmosphere. We want to store as much of that away as possible, but we want to retain enough of it in the biosphere to feed the 8.5 billion people that live on the planet. And there's a lot of difficult decisions that need to be made around that.
And that's you?
And that's me.
And Simon, will you tell us about yourself?
So I'm Simon Gray. I'm the head of Peatland Recovery at Ulster Wildlife, which is Northern Ireland's largest local nature conservation charity, and I basically lead the Peatlands team there, and that means working with landowners across the whole of Northern Ireland in order to try and do everything from mapping the extent of peatlands to assessing their condition to developing restoration plans and actually managing restoration work, active conservation work on the ground. So peatlands, as you already mentioned, a huge area of this island in particular. In fact, Ireland has the fourth largest proportion of its land area covered by peat soils in the world after Canada and Indonesia and Finland. So it's a huge part of our landscape and of our culture. You know, rather than being called peatlands, obviously we much more closely recall them as bogs. But unfortunately, the vast majority of them in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland are in unfavourable condition. So in Northern Ireland in particular, it's somewhere in around the 80% or more than 80% of our peatlands are not in good shape. And peatlands, when they're in a healthy, happy state, they will perform these amazing ecosystem services for us. So they will sequester carbon, they will reduce flooding, they will clean and filter our water, as well as acting as amazing spaces for and homes for biodiversity for really iconic species in our own context, things like curlew or golden plover, large heath butterfly, lapwing, those sorts of things. But when they're degraded, then they not only do none of these things, but they actively really work against us. So, you know, they reduce water quality, they actually make flooding more likely, they emit CO2. So they are a tool that is currently really hindering our efforts in terms of climate change and fighting against it, but they can be completely turned full circle into something that can work and benefit for us. Not that that's the sole reason that we want to work on them. They benefit a huge swathe of other life forms, but yeah, we want to see that moved round the other direction so that they are performing all of these ecosystem services. So that's what we try to do across Northern Ireland.
That's our own ecocide, really, that we're trying to tackle, I suppose, there. And that's where you began, Richard, when you went to Ecuador and saw what was happening after Bolsonaro was elected. How did you come to tell the story of Broken Spectre? You've studied this in the Amazon for years.
Yeah, so as I said, it sort of bonded at that point. I only began to understand or relate to on an emotional level, honestly, like as a human, just to spend time in the middle of the night in the cloud forest looking at these fluorescent organisms on a very microscopic level. It was pretty wonderful, using ultraviolet lamps. And so when Bolsonaro was elected in Brazil, by the way, it was a disaster because when he came to power January 1st, 2019, you know, he really encouraged the North, the families and the mafia groups and the corporations and everyone just to go, go ahead and deforest en masse. And that summer there was an extended dry season, what they call burn season, because of global heating. So yeah, they just burnt for months and months and months. And there was imagery in many of the newspapers that summer around August 2019, which is how I kind of became more aware of it, as we all did, the importance of the documentary image. But at the same time, you see one photo of the burning rainforest, you've seen them all. And so that's, a point of departure for me. I'm interested in the limits of the language. I want to resuscitate tired and sort of saturated imagery, and to try to help the viewer to look again, and to really study the subject and learn, because that's what documentary photography can do. but I find that you have to, at least I find that you have to do that in new and original ways. And so I've developed my own language, which I call the aggravated media. I use specific types of photographic imaging technologies that are somehow complicit in the subject that I'm trying to tell. And so I chose for Brazil, for this story in the Amazon, I chose multispectral imaging, which is used by the scientists, environmental scientists, as I believe you use multispectral imaging in your work, for example, to show us very specific narrow bandwidths of spectral reflectance from the vegetation index, which is in the red and near infrared, what's called red edge, and the infrared. And that, if you dial it in correctly, you can see a lot more than we can see with the human eye, and we can really understand changes in environmental degradation. And so it's also used by the bad guys, multinational mining companies, to pinpoint rare earth minerals in ancestral indigenous territories, massive agribusiness interests. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry, GIS. It's huge, and most of us never heard of it. I hadn't. It's huge. Governments, universities, multinational corporations, they all use it. There's huge satellite programs in the sky dedicated to it. And we've been using it for decades. And a study in 2021 has analyzed several decades of GIS data in the Amazon and to learn to show us the tipping points. So that's allowed us to understand that we have about 10 years left based on multispectral imaging since the 70s and 80s. It shows that 75% of the Amazon is so degraded because of adjacent human deforestation, fronts of deforestation, that it's at the risk of dieback. And once the rainforest can't generate its own rain, it ceases being a rainforest, so it converts automatically into open canopies, savanna-like ecology, which is a process called savanization. And once that happens, there's a vast release of carbon dioxide, not just from the dying biomass in trees, but also from the soil. And so all that stored carbon is released, you guys can tell me more about the science here, into the atmosphere, and adding to an exponential increase in and multiplication in a way of global heating. And that's a process that once we reach that tipping point, we can't reverse. So it's a point of no return. And so this is all told to us by photography. Photography is at the very crux of this subject in a way. It's at one point, it's engaged in, it's responsible for some of this deforestation, as well as offering us a way of understanding it, how bad it's gotten. So, yeah, so as every technology, it's a double-sided sword. That interested me, sorry.
But it comes into the science as well, that delving down deep into those microscopic, kind of very multi-layered images. And you were nodding there, Billy.
Yeah, I mean, the multispectral imagery, we would use a lot of it in seabed mapping. And it can tell us a lot about the sort of the intrinsic qualities of the seabed. And you know, one of the things that we're interested in at the moment, I'm leading a project which is mapping carbon storage in lakes and coastal seas around Northern Ireland, and that's being driven by this desire to understand how much carbon we can potentially store and what the sensitivity of that carbon is to disturbance. So much like the issues in the Amazon with clear felling and deforestation, we have issues in the marine environment where industrial fishing disturbs the seabed and can potentially be releasing carbon dioxide from the seabed back into the atmosphere, because you have this rain of material, planktonic material that's died and has settled down onto the seabed. Some of that's buried, and then you know, where we get disturbance from fishing pressure, for example, you can have that material being brought back up into the water column where it can be eaten essentially by the bacteria and the microorganisms and converted back to carbon dioxide. A similar process in some ways, but the issue there is that we have to consider the management issues, because the global seabed's a global resource, and we have areas around Northern Ireland where we have relatively well managed fisheries, and then you want to put in place fisheries protections here, but you also have to think about what the potential impacts elsewhere are, because when it comes to that environmental degradation aspect, the first cut's really the deepest. So where you displace, say, fishing effort from areas that have been fished for decades to almost 2 centuries now, and that's then displaced, you could see then that fishing effort displaced to somewhere that's essentially virgin seabed that's never been exploited, and it could be out in the sort of Southeast Asia, etc., areas that are where the management regimes are not as easy to aren't there, and essentially we can reach into these issues where food production here is offset and to meet conservation objectives in the Western world, in Western Europe, for example, and we then offset that to developing countries and are importing the food from there.
So moving the problem just to somewhere else, for someone else to deal with, and take it off our agenda?
Yeah, and it's dangerous to say, but in a food security, in the food production side of things, offshoring our food production out of Northern Ireland to meet the conservation objectives here needs to be very carefully considered against what the potential impacts are in places like Southeast Asia, the Amazon, because at the end of the day, that's a modern form of colonialism, and it's not a nice word to use, but it is sort of where we can end up with the situation that we have. These are difficult problems.
And that's part of what we're trying to do. There are lots of schemes aimed at reducing our carbon imprint and so on. I mean, Northern Ireland's in a very difficult position in that we import more than 350,000 tonnes of grain and of soy, and we did that in 2022, and exported 140,000 tonnes of processed animal feed to the Republic, because we're trying to create more efficient animals to reduce the carbon footprint. But we're really just shuffling that carbon around. And when you look at peat bogs, Simon, I mean, the challenge that we have there, because we're trying to create, look at our agriculture, which is so successful but very intensive, and we can see the impact that that's had on our peat bogs and on our land for decades.
I mean, it's a really interesting thing to talk about, Billy, is that we're, to some degree, if we all keep consuming the same amount of stuff, and whether it's food or product or whatever it is, at the same rate that we're doing, then if we don't change that level of consumption, then if you stop doing it in one place, then effectively it's just going to erupt or be moved to somewhere else. I mean, actually, I was just thinking in terms of a peatland context. Peat extraction is one thing that has been going on in Ireland, both north and south, for a very, very long time. We would very much like to see that stop and move towards a ban in time, but as long as there is still a demand for it and at the same scale, what's actually happened is that if we start to reduce the industry here, then we get huge amounts of peat that's extracted from Latvia, Lithuania, lots of places around Eastern Europe. So if you buy peat briquettes, for example, those kind of almost plastic-looking peat briquettes that you would burn on the stove, very often even now those end up coming from places in Eastern Europe. But it's kind of very challenging at the minute, because we have lots of these targets around reducing carbon in our own landscape, and forestry is another great example at the minute, whereby research has shown that coniferous forest plantations on peatlands, even with the sequestration that you get from planting those trees and the trees growing, because you're planting them on deep peat and you're draining them and ground prepping there, the emissions you get from doing that ground prep actually completely negate all of the emissions reductions you get from the trees. So that means that then we're now moving towards a policy whereby you don't plant trees on deep peat areas, which is where, if you look at land distribution of forestry across the whole of Ireland and GB, that's where historically a lot of trees were planted, because that ground was cheap historically and nobody else wanted it. We can't plant it there anymore. That means now that you have to try and then plant it on ground that is probably more agriculturally productive, which means now you've got trees that are competing with more agricultural production, and whether it's beef or dairy or poultry. And now we're trying to fight over what we can do with the land in the right place in order to get these results. And then we end up having situations whereby you move your footprint somewhere else. And as you have seen then, that is very often into places that we, in this kind of privileged society, then don't often see, even though indirectly it is a lot of stuff that we want on a regular basis, which might end up then having that impact. So it's the same, peatlands are under the same fire here that a lot of other habitats are under. Whether it's historically that pressure is taking place or whether it's now, it's still going on, but there is just such a challenge at the minute for everybody to decide on what is the best way to use each parcel of land that we have, because ultimately land is finite. And if we put more restrictions on what we can do in certain places, we still have to feed ourselves, but in my opinion, we probably eat quite a lot.
Speak for yourself. Yeah.
Maybe just me.
But you saw that, Richard, didn't you, in the Amazon, just the demand from the West, the impact that it's having there to create food, to support food production.
Yeah, and ironically, Brazil is one of the biggest exporters of beef, I think the biggest, but the big urban centres like Sao Paulo and Rio and Belém and places, there's a lot of starving people in the centre who are so impoverished they can't eat beef at all. So that food isn't going to Brazilian people, it's being exported onto global markets. And according to Naomi Klein, 25% of all carbon emissions in all of them that we produce are about moving food around. So the further we go for our sirloin steak, the more carbon emissions that are attached to it. And so it's the cheaper beef products, usually typically, that end up in Burger King and stuff. Burger King, I believe, allegedly buys from JBS, which is a Brazilian multinational who have huge amounts of cattle, and most of them come from recently culled primary rainforest, and then are fattened up on intensive feedlots and slaughtered and processed in huge factories and sent out on ships. And it's not just the beef, it's also the leather that goes into our cars, car seats, and the shoes that we wear. And yeah, so it's a funny thing because you'd think, oh, that's a terrible problem that's going on over there, nothing we can do. But actually, having spent a lot of time with the environmental criminals themselves, the agents, the ones carrying out the labor of deforestation, in a way, we have more agency than they do. They have very few opportunities. They're just carrying out the labor, as I said, and we're the ones paying for it. And it's not just what we just choose to buy in Marks and Spencer's or whatever, I don't know where you're buying, but it's also our investment funds and like your retirement funds and your bank, just the bank like I bank with Chase Bank in New York, and they are directly involved in infrastructure projects that cut right through the heart of indigenous territories in Brazil, like to more profitably bring the soybean from Mato Grosso to the Tapajós, to the Amazon, up to global markets. And so, yeah, if I could stop banking with that bank, that'd be great. But then Citibank are really big into carbon, hydrocarbon industries, and it's hard, we're all part of it. And I think that's my goal as a storyteller, as an artist, is to make you feel that uneasy sense of complicity, rather than wag your finger at an individual on screen and say, that's a bad man, we should lock him up. Actually, we should be feeling that sense of indictment. And that's a hard thing to do, because a lot of art is about affirmation nowadays. It's about making people feel good. But there's really not a whole lot to feel good about what's happening in the Amazon basin. But there are good stories. At the same time, it's such a vast subject to relate. The changes are very abstract. They're about climate, after all, and they affect weather patterns all across the world. How do I, as a photographer, show you that concretely? I can't. Photography is all about putting the damn thing in front of the damn lens, and if you can't do that, you don't have an image. So there's no way I can really depict that. So I'm struggling really with this very dumb medium, concrete medium, and I want to tell you something that's beyond language, actually, beyond certainly photographic language, and that's really the problem we have with trying to advocate for climate issues and climate awareness, is that this is a subject that not only gives us a lot of eco-anxiety and we don't want to hear about anymore, but it's really hard to tell. It's just bigger than us. And we, as humans, we relate to things that are very local and human-related, naturally. So as a storyteller, that's why I tried to focus in on more hyper-local individuals in the film. If you do watch it, you'll find there's the beating heart of the film is this young Indigenous woman who gives a very powerful speech.
That's Adnaya Yanomami from the tribe, which is one of, I think, I made a note there the other day about there's 47 million people actually live in and around the Amazon, 2 million Indigenous and 300 languages spoken, and she is one, and she's really the only voice as such in the film because of the power of that person. Really, I mean, that using that voice to convey that personal impact. I mean, to tell that then, how impactful was that for you to hear her and to be spoken to by her, spoken at by her, perhaps?
Well, yeah, no, and I didn't know what she was saying because I don't speak Yanomama, but I could tell she was really shouting at me in this very confrontational way, and she was looking down the lens of the camera, breaking that fourth wall, so to speak, and I knew she had something. She was really angry. She was raging, but very powerful. And then at the end, she broke down into tears, and any human can understand that language. And it took me 8 months to have it translated, because it was hard to find anyone who could translate it into Portuguese and then into English. And then reading the transcript was incredible, because she understood all the problems of documentary photography, of the white man parachuting in. And she holds me to account. She's like, don't just come in here. And we're not dressed up like this. They painted themselves, their faces in a special war paint, especially for the camera. But they weren't, as she reminds me, they're not doing that for nothing, you know. And so this is really extraordinary, because by extension, she's pointing her finger at you, the viewer, and all of us. But she's doing it nonetheless because she wants to communicate, and she understands the power of the camera and of her image, and of politics. So it's actually an act of politics, and she's trying to get you to advocate for her community. She says, tell your mothers and fathers, tell your leaders. So it's an extraordinary thing, and there was a certain duty I had once I understood what she was saying. But there are, as I said, go back to it, there are real limits to storytelling and to photography and to climate awareness. And I think that we all have a problem helping people care about these things. It's hard. And
you're doing it on a 20-meter screen with images. I mean, that's hard as well at that scale.
Yeah.
To break it.
But then at the same time, I'm working as an artist, so I'm creating a very different kind of thing than a report where you learn all these facts and statistics. It's a very different type of storytelling, and so you don't go away knowing more in terms of the actual facts on the ground, and perhaps you understand the texture of what it looks like. But I'm not telling you all of these facts. They're all out there, and I think my job as a storyteller is to make you feel that. That's what artists can do, is to feel, to help you feel something. That's all we can do, actually. But at the same time, yeah, you guys have been giving us the facts for many decades.
I think one of the problems there is a question of scale, though, in terms of the facts. And I don't know, maybe you might have some thoughts on this, because actually this is one of the key concerns, is that we talk about climate change and we talk about concern about breaching the 1.5 degree global temperature increases, and how we come back from that. And 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like very much. We need to kind of somehow qualify that. And I can give you another example of that, is that I'm involved in, I curate the temperature recording in the Irish Sea and contribute that to some of the reports that ultimately go towards the IPCC report. And within that Irish Sea temperature time series, we've seen over the last 25 years the decadal temperature increase tends to go up about 0. So a hundredth of a degree, 0.01, or no, yeah, 0.01 degrees over per decade. But we've seen an increase of that over the last 10 years. It's gone up to 0.96 degrees per decade, which is just below a degree over the last decade in terms of an increase. And that's massive for me. That looks massive, but when you then plot that across the whole, it becomes very difficult to make that line look visually arresting and actually make people notice it. And that's one of the issues, you know. How do we get members of the public to actually realize this, you know, that these are urgent issues, and then put that against policymakers who have a host of other problems that they're trying to deal with. You know, you have issues with education, with healthcare. People are, you know, in a cost of living issue. So there are people in this society who don't necessarily have enough to eat even here. And how do we make that how do you make that balance, that priority? How do you kind of qualify those figures and give them a human dimension?
I think that's the real challenge of what you've done then, is that, and you're talking about how it's such an intangible thing. Climate change is this big amorphous blob that nobody can access. It doesn't have any handles or any buttons on it. It's just this horrible mess that nobody can actually, there's nowhere to start or end. And you've done a brilliant job of telling that story and putting that into something that people can understand the scale and the motivations and the hurt and the feelings, particularly in that part of the world. I think actually where we need to do much better is utilising mediums like yours to tell some of the stories that we have at home as well. Because that is rightly so, telling that story, but I do also feel uncomfortable at times. You've really highlighted this about, you know, Western people coming into situations like this and you know, often pointing the finger at local people that are literally just wanting to make money and progress their lives, feed their kids, get jobs. And it's very awkward for us because we're in a society that just did all that historically, and we've kind of just forgotten about it. You know, we drained all of our wetlands, we cut down all of our trees. That just happened such a long time ago that none of us know it, or none of us really experienced it. But we're living on the benefits of the destruction that happened generations ago. So we can't, it's very uncomfortable for us to turn around then and wag fingers at those people and say, no, you can't do that. You can't progress to the same stage that we have through the same means that we have done. And I do think that we need to be using the photography and documentary kind of medium a lot more often in order to showcase what we have done here, what is still ongoing. We're talking about how, you know, maybe intensively managed agriculture here still utilises and benefits from the systems that are in places like Brazil or Latin America or wherever else it is, in a way then that makes this more tangible for people so that they can actually see potentially how it isn't just that far-flung thing which is going on there. It's not just flooding in Germany, it's not just deforestation in Brazil, it's not just a monsoon in Southeast Asia. You know, this is still connected to that wider system, even though it's only in Dungannon or, I don't know, Kilkenny, wherever. I think that's something that we really have struggled with here, is making it tangible in a way that people can actually see that the impact of what we have done here historically and we are continuing to do now is linked to that thing which is going on there in the same way. But it's not easy, you know.
It's funny you say that because the Broken Spectre is actually a Western film. That's one of the weirdest things and the sort of key image that I saw in the field. Driving down the Trans-Amazonian Highway was, in the early part of my research, was this charred rainforest, which you see everywhere, but then trotting over the carbonized hill was a cowboy with a 10-gallon hat and the chaps and the cowboy boots and the buckle. And he was herding cattle through this burnt field of, you know, burnt trees. And I thought, that's very strange. I thought that the cowboy was the Lone Ranger in the Wild West and the Monument Valley, you know, because I grew up watching RTE, you know, I was a very deprived person. That's all we got, you know, and the Lone Ranger was, you know, he was the cowboy and there was a sort of desert. And so I thought, that's very strange. And I researched it, and every town has a rodeo, you know, and they listen to country music. And so I researched cowboy culture, and it turns out it started in Spain about 400 or 500 years ago, and it was exported all the way around the world in various forms. It reached the United States, where it became its own distinct thing, but it also went to Argentina, to the Pampas, where they became the gauchos, and to the northeast of Brazil, where they became the vaqueros. But weirdly, in the Amazon, by the way, in 1970, we'd only lost 1% of the Amazon to man's hand, to human deforestation. Today, we've lost almost 20%. So that's it, all within 50 years, within living memory. And that's because the Brazilian military dictatorship was very influenced by neoliberalist ideas, University of Chicago, and they loved to build roads, just like Margaret Thatcher. So they built a lovely big road called the Trans-Amazonian Highway, right through the forest to develop it, to link businesses. And then they needed people. So they just took people and displaced them. This is a government agency called INCRA in Brazil. And they just took people and dropped them all the way along the road to populate it. And they gravitated towards North American cowboy culture, what they call Texano cowboy culture. It's very interesting, anthropologically. So I was like, oh, here's my window of access for a Western viewer. Because we in the United States did all this 150 years ago. And that, when I say all this, I mean, turning the wilderness or nature into our God-given birthright, dominion, destroying it, turning it into monoculture. It's written in the book of Genesis, and rounding up the indigenous communities, sometimes murdering them. All of that stuff went on 150 years ago in the United States, and it's happening real time now. And I would venture to say it happened in various parts of Europe 400 years ago. This idea of manifest destiny, it's a European idea. And it's the export of those European ideas under the name of colonialism, for example, or religion, that gives us this spirit of the frontier, of settling. We see all this in the north of Brazil right now in the Amazon. Call it what you will, but it's very strange to look at. It's an incongruous type of Western imagery because they're not white. They're primarily Brazilian, which is mixed race, very, very mixed race country, and they don't speak English, and yet they sing the songs and they dance the line dancing. So I thought that if I could make that a motif of the film, it would allow us to relate to it in terms of our own history.
So you take us deep into the Amazon and deep in with those techniques that you used, but these are techniques that you too use as scientists and conservationists as well. So how then do you use those images that you're looking at as a scientist in a microscope and you're looking at as a conservationist standing in a bog, knowing what you're looking at? How do you then turn those around to find that human hook to bring people here, to give that relativity here? That's the challenge, isn't it?
That is, yeah. I mean, we very much utilise that kind of technology in order to find where the issues are. So, I mean, we use LiDAR technology a lot with drones and with airplanes to map areas of peatland because LiDAR will penetrate vegetation. It allows us to see the underlying topography of peatland areas, and that's very good at picking out things like old drainage channels, old turf banks, peat hags, eroded areas, all that sort of stuff. And that allows us to see where the problems are so that we can then go in and try and fix them. But strangely enough, actually, we were talking about the human connection. The other great thing that LiDAR is great at picking up is previous settlement and archaeological features. So there is a lot of work that's been done in peatlands utilising this technology, which you're looking for these features, but then inadvertently you end up finding some Iron Age rath or a ring fort or something along those lines that showed that the people have been inhabiting this area for thousands of years. In fact, one of the most well-known ancient sites in Northern Ireland is the Baymore Stone Circles out in the middle of Tyrone. And I did not realise until I started working in this field and we started to have to incorporate this archaeological element into what we do. They were more or less completely covered in peat before they were excavated. So there was a little tiny bit of the stones that were just sat above the turf before they were actually dug out, and then the whole things were made invisible. But there is a lot of research that's actually been shown when it comes to peatlands that people are really interested, particularly here, in that human and heritage and cultural connection to those landscapes and those habitats, more so than they are still enjoy it or interested in the biodiversity elements and the climate elements. But if you can show that cultural connection to these habitats, then people here definitely buy into them more. And I think more so than many other parts of the world, we in Ireland have this inextricable link to the bog. We have We've been sacrificing people, we've been harvesting things from it, we've been walking across it and cutting it and utilising it for as long as we have resided on this island. And I think we need to try and blend this modern technology that we're using along with that inextricable cultural and historical link there in a way then that does some of what Richard is doing to try and showcase this story of how what we have done in the past, what we are doing now, links to everything in terms of how it's impacting both here and abroad. But it's a big challenge.
Yeah, and Billy, we were chatting beforehand, you were saying you're being pulled more into some of the work around Lough Neagh because we saw that people could visibly see the change, the impact, that carbon cycle, the impact of agriculture and other pollution on the Lough.
Yeah.
That was very impactful.
And this is one of the real challenges we have with what goes on underneath the water, is that it's kind of what's happening beneath the surface is cloaked from us. We're able to go and put cameras down or put down instruments and take measurements, but to get that scale, certainly in terms of visible light, it's very difficult. You're dealing with a medium that's not clear. Essentially, you've got plants and animals that live in the water that are filtering out the light, increasing the turbidity, and reducing the scale at which you can see. So, when you think about the capacity of LiDAR to sort of make these large landscape scale measurements, that's limited under the water. We can still do things, but we have to look to other technologies, things like side scan or multi-beam sonar. We use multi-spectral imaging and various other techniques. I think one of the interesting things is that, tying that back, there's a whole host of submerged landscapes that are out there that, only get revealed when we start to actually do these surveys, and you start to see that there are whole villages and things that are in archaeological features that are essentially abandoned under the water in many places. And I think, I'm sort of amused because, talking about a cowboy film, here we are in Northern Ireland, and boy, people from Strabane love a cowboy.
Oh no,
and it's a huge
dangerous territory there.
But it is a huge, there is a huge country and western cowboy culture element to the culture in this part of the world.
We always look west. We've
Yeah.
always looked west, haven't we, as an island? Well, I'm going to look to my north, south, east, west now. I'm not very good with my compass. I'd like to bring you in for your questions now. We can aim to anybody on the panel. We've got a mic roving here. We've plenty of time, so hands up. Who wants to be the first one to shout? Don't be shy.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel, it's great. I'm a photographer, but I also work in conservation, so this has been the perfect panel for me. I'm interested, Richard, in the element of collaboration that must have happened, so obviously to get the access that you needed to have the film. How did you find working with local communities, NGOs, and then corporations like the miners and things like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because Brazil was in a state of crisis during the pandemic, so I began the film prior to the pandemic, and then it broke in 2020, as we all know, and Bolsonaro he refused the Pfizer vaccine, and yeah, so the health system in Brazil is really not very good, and so it was a real crisis, huge amount of death everywhere, and it was as bad as the United States actually, and as well as that, because he was actively defunding and undermining the environmental protections agencies such as FUNAI, who protect the indigenous, and IBAMA, who protect the forest, and other ones, INPE, the space agency, and all the others. None of the officials would talk to me. So at the same time, the indigenous communities are genetically vulnerable to respiratory diseases, and they always have been. And that's, you know, something to really take into account, which they did, and many indigenous shielded and went into the forest further to protect themselves. Very smart move. And these, you know, the way to travel is the river. There's very few roads leading into these places, so if you got sick, there was no way to get to healthcare unless you had the money to get a private airplane, which is big money, you know. And yeah, so that they were off limits for me too, until they all had a good vaccine, which eventually came. And so I really had to go grassroots for the most of the first part of making the film, and just try to deal with the environmental criminals themselves, who are all mostly anti-vax, and really didn't give a damn. And so I would knock on doors, and many of the doors they would slam in my face because I was asking to film them carrying out crimes. But you know, I managed to build relationships with some of them, and they were in the illegal gold mining communities, like these little western cowboy towns, which are full of criminality along these rivers, and a lot of disease and a lot of drugs and a lot of weapons. But by building these relationships, you start to get access that way. And then the illegal loggers allowed me to work with them. And so that was great, because I made a very different type of film than I would have. A lot of people go there and they go straight in with an indigenous community, because that's a natural entryway into the story. They are the guardians of the forest. But I couldn't. And so as a result, I got a very sort of measured, I feel, of course I feel that, but I do think it had a beneficial impact on the film. And eventually I managed to get in at a point where, with the Yanomami, where they had received the vaccine, and it was very hard. You know, they're very smart, their community. Their land is the size of the United Kingdom or Portugal. It's huge. And their leadership, David Copanau and his son Dario, they're really, really smart people. So to get that access was very complicated, and it took a lot of negotiating and careful coordination. And then I had to hire these light aircraft, because it's 6 days upriver. Otherwise, I didn't have the time. And they were at that time, her community were under attack with automatic weapons from Garimperos. So it was an active sort of conflict zone, and they were being terrorized at night. And so they organized as soon as we landed. They were hiding in the bushes, but then they saw Junior, their leader, and they all ran out, and they were all with spears, and whoever had a shotgun had a shot. You know, they were ready. They didn't know whether we were miners or not. And they were very grateful, because they'd been abandoned by all the Brazilian. And the federal police hadn't come. The health authority, SESAI, they fled. So they were totally on their own, and every night they were being strafed with automatic fire and tear gas grenades, because there was a confrontation 2 weeks prior. And so that was a very specific encounter, which was really the fault line, an active fault line. And that was important, because it's hard to find those places normally.
Did you feel at risk when you were dealing with the illegal miners? Did you ever feel at any point, this is happening to me being hurt or killed?
Yeah, well, there was a moment there overnight when a boat full of miners approached the village, and all of the Yanomami spread out around the village and started calling to each other with animal sounds. So we got the sound recorder out, and it was too dark to film, and we recorded that, and that's in the film actually. In the lead up to Andnea speaking, you can hear these cries sounding like animals. That's the warning signals. And but no, the illegal logger scene was where the burners, where they set fire to that was probably the most dangerous. After they flee, because it's what they're doing is highly illegal and visible. And then there was neighbouring farmers surrounded us with machetes and threatened us, but nothing happened, luckily. But no, yeah, you have to be very careful and never steal an image. It's all about building relationships. It's all about consent, just merely for whatever about your code of ethics for your security. If you don't have consent in those places, it's very sort of Hobbesian state of war kind of place. There are police, but they're really not police. They're criminals themselves in some of these parts. So it was really an extraordinary place to work. And there were I didn't work with the unions of illegal miners, for example. That's interesting you bring that up. You must know something about the subject. Yeah.
Well, in Brazil, no, not much, but obviously in the Belfast Hills Partnership, we work with private landowners, with conservation charities and things like that, so there is always an element of being diplomatic and discussing your main goal, which is to preserve the Belfast Hills, which is a huge area of urban green space and that's useful on lots of different levels, but then it's used in different ways. Recreationally, people on scramblers, there's all these different elements that come together. And so I was interested to know, how would you approach somewhere that's even larger in its geographical scale? Because even just on the Belfast Hills, it's tricky, to keep everybody happy.
Yeah.
Or happy enough,
Well, the key for me was with the environmental criminals, particularly the gold miners, for example, and the loggers, and the burners, and these are real mafia groups. So it's to appeal to their sense of machismo, to make them feel like big men and who've achieved a lot in their lives. And once you've got them feeling like powerful in that way, they can't say no to you. So then you ask for access. So to say no would be to show weakness. And then, there was something else but I've forgotten. But no, it was very interesting. That's true.
You're dealing with lots of masculinity to actually gain access.
Very true. But there's actual UN studies about how it's women in these communities who are the first, sort of the front line of suffering, the first victims of environmental damage, and as a result are the most powerful advocates, as we can see. I think I've seen that firsthand.
Thanks very much. Okay, hands up. See, there's one over here. And sorry, there as well.
Hi, my name is Rachel Simcoffin. I'm a behavioural scientist and I specialise in environmental behaviour. And I noticed across the panel, for me, it seemed like there was a theme of connection as being really important in this area. And connection is it's known to be a great driver of behaviour change. But I wonder if, like yourselves working in this space, and this is really to all three of you, if I can be as greedy as that,
of course.
how do you retain connection with your subject matter in an area that can be so overwhelming? And I think, Richard, you used the term correctly there, that eco-anxiety that comes about here. How do you retain the connection that's needed to persist with what you do without being overwhelmed into paralysis of inactivity? I'd love to know that.
I'm happy to start. It is easy to get overwhelmed, definitely. We're currently at this stage in my own field in peatland restoration in Northern Ireland, where we have this absolute massive mountain to climb. Our draft peatland strategy is looking for us to try and restore up to 7,500 hectares of peatland per year between now and 2050. And to make that tangible for people, a hectare's roughly about a football pitch, and it's probably about the size of the Mourns every year. Anytime I kind of let that sink in, I kind of get terrified. I'm not trying to do it on my own, thank God, but it is pretty overwhelming. I think in order to maintain that connection, it's for me, it's often about small wins, and this definitely is a game of baby steps in a lot of respects. So, got a phone call from a landowner in the Sperrins the other day who just rang up and said that he had a bit of ground, about 11 hectares in scale, who was cut for turf in the 90s, and he wanted to see that go back to nature, and that was a direct quote, that was his words. And I think I definitely hold on to those situations wherever I see those wins. So I know that we're not going to be getting wholesale, massive, huge bits of restoration being done right now or tomorrow. But if I see those little glints of positivity, and if I can over time see those start to build and see the results, then that allows me to kind of calm down from that 7,500 hectare figure and realize that, okay, maybe we can move in the right direction at least. I was out on a site yesterday that we did restoration work on in 2020, actually, just literally before the pandemic hit, and seeing that as well. So definitely one of the benefits that we have is that whenever we do work, you can see benefits really quite quickly. And whenever you can get that, that is very tangible. I think one of the big challenges that we have a lot of these issues is that it can be very hard and very slow in order to get wins that you can see and you can hold on to. And I mean, we put dams into drains, the water built up behind them, and now whenever I go out to those areas, they're covered in sphagnum moss and there's so much more life. We saw a large heath butterfly on that site there yesterday for the first time, and I've worked on it for 5 years. Those things are the things that I think make me still remain positive about the way forward. But there are moments of darkness that creep in every once in a while.
So farmers like that become beacons, really, don't they?
They definitely do, yeah.
And Billy, yourself?
Yeah, I think probably one of the things that helps me, I'm one of the great privileges of my job, I guess, is that I'm an environmental scientist and I get to spend time in the field. And actually, for me, spending time at sea is one of the things that helps me to feel connected with the system, the kind of the environment that I study, and put the kind of eco-anxiety to the side to some extent, because I spend, my days in the office, I can spend a day looking at climate change statistics essentially and come out from that and it's just, you just feel an overwhelming sense of misery leaving the office, and that's a horrible way to take yourself home. Having that opportunity to be out and at sea, and to, some of that time is unpleasant. You're on a moving ship. The weather can be rough. It can be cold. It can be windy. But actually having that physical exposure to the elements to some extent, to feel the cold, and to you collect samples. We maybe are collecting sediment samples. To have that kind of tactile feeling of cold, wet, horrible mud, I find really kind of reassuring in all of this. And that, I think that would be one of the key things. And then there's the opportunities that come from that. The times that you're seeing dolphins, porpoises. We've seen a humpback whale last summer in the Irish Sea, and I think that's the first time in 10 years there's been one. And those are the really special moments, or being on the north side of Rathlin, where very few people actually ever really see that landscape from that perspective. I think it's just having those opportunities to see the majesty in nature.
I think that is it's a real bugbear of mine I'm not going to let go by in this country in particular, is that we have some of the poorest access to the countryside here in Europe. We are unbelievably cordoned off from access to the countryside in this particular part of the world. I remember reading a statistic a while ago that Wales, as a not dissimilar country to Northern Ireland, at least anyway, in terms of its scale, its the use of its countryside in terms of agriculture, all that sort of stuff, Wales has somewhere in the region of about 20,000 kilometres of public rights of way. Northern Ireland, by comparison, has less than 500. We can't get to our countryside in order to connect with it. So, I mean, we're both talking about examples here whereby we've been out, we've felt it, we've got wet feet, we've got wind in our face, all those sorts of things. Attenborough has said himself, God knows how many times, that people will not care about these things unless they experience them. And in this country, it is so annoying that we cannot actually open a gate and go into somewhere in order to experience it. So that is something that we drastically need to change here. In Scotland, they have got a right to roam where people can go into the countryside almost anywhere, and it is brilliant. But here we have a very select few places that you can actually go, that you can see these things, touch them, feel them, get annoyed at them, or get sweaty and warm and cold and all these sorts of things. And that is something that we drastically need to change if we want people to connect with these things.
There was a map last year actually published from a group looking at that. Yeah, I can't remember the name, I'm afraid, but I'll find it online definitely. Richard, back to the question about that.
Yeah, thanks for it. It's a great question. It's a tough one. Yeah, in the Amazon, the more people you speak to, and I'm talking about activists who you meet everywhere, as well as scientists who you also meet everywhere, people gathering data and stuff, and so you'd try to ask them. So, can you get a sense of the situation? And there's a general sense of pessimism verging on despair about the Amazon widely, amongst activists, and it's not great, honestly. And so Bolsonaro, by very, very, very narrow margin, like we're talking way, way more razor thin than what happened with Biden and Trump, he was voted out and Lula got in, which is a great thing for the rainforest, don't get me wrong, but it simply slows down the processes. And there's a general sense that unless there's a real overturning of our minds, of our psychology, of our ways of living, of our behavior, of our entire system, and that perhaps is about capital, is about money, the ways in which we consume, but also just the ways we engage with the world, the material world. And unless there's a radical transformation quite quickly, I don't see a way the Amazon won't be destroyed. I mean, and that's really depressing to say. And I'm not here to make you throw your hands up and say, well, there's nothing to be done. That's I have to stay on. I'm here to do the opposite. And so I'm looking for the little bits of, as you say, the little bits of things that you can actually measure. And that's really hard as a photographer, because I'm not an activist in that sense. I'm not dealing with like the very specific concrete things that you can measure the change in terms of what I'm documenting. I'm showing you very big general subjects. But for example, there's a scene in the film where the indigenous community, the Terra Libre with the ATL, Free Land Conference in Brasilia, where all the indigenous communities, and there's hundreds, they all go to Brasilia, the capital city, and they protested for a week to protest against Bolsonaro's package of laws that were going to steal land from them, their own land, as well as many other things, including open their land to multinational mining companies. And that activization, probably produced a number of additional votes in favor of Lula, which probably, because it was so razor thin, resulted in Bolsonaro's defeat. And he can't go to power again. So, it's little things like that that really matter, and this sense that democracy is not dead, and the people still have some power left, and that we have power in our decisions, and I think that those are very important things, because Adnea herself, it's very rhetorical. Speech, she's asking questions at the end. She's like, we're really thinking of who can help us, because no one's helping them. And so the next scene is them helping themselves in Brasilia. And they got rid of Bolsonaro, and that's extraordinary. But to go back to this idea of what will save the forest, I think it's to look at indigenous ways of thinking. I don't know how, without getting sentimental about that, I don't know how we can, and that's the big challenge, at how we can sort of incorporate that into our own way of life.
Great question. Thank you very much. More hands? Is that you? Get the microphone up to you.
Hello. Thank you very much for the panel. Really interesting. I think rightly, I feel the concern you talk about, and the kind of, there is a natural doom and gloom, and you should feel that watching the film or coming to a panel like this. But what would you recommend someone like myself or other people here do next? Like, what do you take from a panel like this? What do you take from watching a film like yours, Richard? What impact can you actually make as an individual?
Well, I'll answer that, but you guys have to answer it after me. Okay. When I was a younger photographer, I was really jaded and cynical about the power of the camera and the power of myself as an image maker, and I didn't think I could affect the world. And I've seen, through the process of making images, I've seen that that's wrong. I've seen that there's a power in the image, and I think that young documentary photographers and photographers of all kinds need to understand the power of culture, of their own image making, and that's real stuff, and we're part of society, and we can, through communication, we can change the world through perception. I think that's really important to remember. And to pass that on, I think what you guys are doing is obviously crucial. So, go ahead.
Go for it. You're next.
I mean, there's a number of things I would say. I mean, one of them is vote.
That's good.
And I think actually and that's not just about voting in terms of an election, making choices in your active choices in your life to do things to improve the situation around you. Connect with the landscape, I suppose, and find ways, if you're a photographer, if you're interested in anything, find ways to tell those stories. If I had one of the things make use of the landscape we've got. I think, people who go out and wild swim or, trail run or scuba dive or paddleboard and find some connection with the landscape and the environment, just generally will care more about preserving, protecting that environment and making choices that are good for the environment. And you'll see that there isn't necessarily, things aren't necessarily as bad as what the picture. You can still find joy and pleasure in that.
Yeah, you can stand in a peat bog and admire the beauty of a desolate landscape.
You can, yeah, if you're wearing wellies.
If you're wearing wellies, definitely. Been there, done that.
The one thing that I would say, it goes back to what Billy has said there about choices, is that very unfortunately the way that our civilization has ended up directing us towards is that so many of us are just running around like headless chickens, just making sure that we can keep running around like headless chickens all the time. And we often, even though we think we have choices, it's a challenge to make sure that we do. We end up moving on to the next thing without even thinking about it, because maybe that's all we've always done, or because that's what society has forced us in order to move into that next stage. But if we can almost, as many of us, try to take a breath and take a beat and try and actually be more conscious about those choices that we make, whether that's about how you get from A to B, whether you came here in a bus or Toby came here on a bike and made me feel terrible about driving, or what you eat. I mean, the other thing that I would say then is try and not feel jaded about making decisions that are going to be beneficial as well. There's lots of people that say, one of the biggest and easiest things that you could do is probably reduce the amount of meat that you eat overall. But then it's very annoying then whenever you're out for a drink with your mate and then you say like, oh yeah, I've only started eating meat like twice a week, and then you go, oh, what are you doing that for? And then you go, oh God, well, maybe I should just go back to eating meat again. Just try and live through that like demonization of trying to be more progressive, because that is hard. It's difficult to be maybe the first person that takes that step. But I do think that we need to maybe be a lot more conscious about the choices that we just do make every day. And that is one of the easiest way, not the easiest, it is quite hard, but it's one of the ways that overall, if everybody did that, we make systemic change then. If everybody just decided to stop eating quite as much meat or to drive as much as they are, then we would have huge benefits. But it takes everybody to make those individual decisions to get a big, wide impact. And a shameless plug, you can definitely support organisations like ours who do work like what we do, and not just support it by becoming members. My colleague Patrick is going to be outside if anybody wants to become a member. But to volunteer with us as well. Come out and actually see and connect with the work that we are doing and what we do all the time. Because then, as Billy has said and I've said, that is how you will then feel value in these things. If you don't understand it, not even that if you don't understand, but if you don't connect with it, if you've not experienced it, it's so hard to give these things value then. And if you don't have value, then you will just simply bin them or forget about them without a worry in your head at all. But if you've gone out and experienced a peat bog, and then the next time you come around, it's drained, you will care. But if you've never gone there in the first place, you'll never have known that it was gone. So I would say definitely do what Billy is talking about, go out and experience these places, but also as you're doing that, try and just take a minute if you can, and it is hard, to just think a little bit more about those choices that you make just every single day. And it will, if everybody does that, have a society-wide impact.
Can we ask you what you think?
I was just about to say. Normally, nearly every event that I go to, I end up telling people, and I know I'm a rosy-eyed optimist, and people laugh at me, but I always say that I really, honestly, firmly believe that we as human beings deal far better in hope than we ever do in despair. And I'll say that to people, and they're like, "Oh, but we're given to that in Northern Ireland. We tend to look a little bit on the bleak side of things." But I was quite shocked by somebody who remained totally nameless, very intelligent person, a colleague at work, intelligent human being, who said, well, what's the point of me making a change? Because the reason I was talking to her, I haven't taken a lift voluntarily since the start of this year. That's been my thing this year, that I won't use a lift because it takes something ridiculous like 2 kilowatts of power to just start a lift before it comes to you or takes you to where you want to go. And I figure that's my little contribution. But this woman had hit the button, and I thought, oh, for crying out loud, why are you taking a lift? It's only like 6 flights of stairs and they're short. But anyway, bit of glute workout, you know. So I went up in the lift with her. I said, this is only like the 5th or 6th lift I've been in this year. And she said, oh, why is that? I explained, well, it's my wee thing. She said, well, what's the point of me doing that when China's still belching out blah, blah, blah? And I said, well, hang on, it's not the one big thing. It's the millions of little things. And that's where we find our power. I think that's where we create our hope and where we tackle our despair. And whether it is cutting down on meat, whether it is connecting with the place in which you live, whether it is looking beyond our borders, whether it's as simple as I don't use, say you decide, well, I'm not going to use a disposable cup, or I'm going to plant a tree, or I'm going to put some plants in the garden, I'm going to grow something in a pot on my windowsill, I'm going to move more, I'm going to take the lift less, I'm going to try the bus, I'm going to try cycling. It's the little actions that create our hope in the despair. And I get eco-anxiety because it's my daily job of work. And there are days I come out of work going, oh, I get really quite distressed about it. But then I think, okay, well, what can I do? And these are the things I can do. And this is the impact I can have and the change I can make, and tell people about it. It's like you say, you have to be prepared to be laughed at and still stand there resolute. It's easier if you were a geek at primary school, I'm just saying. So have we any more questions? I'm conscious time is starting to tick, but we've still got a few more minutes. There's another one, and there. Yep. We'll try and squeeze you all in as best as we can.
It's probably a follow-up maybe on the last 2 questions, but have any of you experienced or seen any evidence of like an actual just transition out of the ways of living around, so not just in this country? They wouldn't talk about just transition, people think about fossil fuels out of the oil industry into green technologies, but we were talking about farming and food systems there, like in this country, how you reproposition that land something more useful, but then you take that problem to maybe somewhere like Brazil for food production. Like, have any of you seen evidence of actual just transitioning starting to happen or happening?
I'd say it's slow. But going back to one of the things that you said that I didn't even think of, but it is, I mean, you need to vote, because even though it is down to individuals, it is not solely down to us, because we are hemmed into working and living in certain systems in a particular way, and that won't change unless politically things change. But I mean, I've seen little glimpses of potential transitions. Things like, there's a word that is not widely known, but pollutoculture is a thing whereby you farm on permanently wet ground, which we have literally spent the entirety of civilization on this island fighting against wet ground. But in parts of the world, it is the way that you work with the landscape in terms of the way it naturally should be with high water tables. You can grow, blueberries or watercress or all those sorts of different things. And there are little pilots and projects that are going on in the Midlands of Ireland, for example, where they're seeing, is this viable? Because if you raise the water table on up to the surface of areas that are currently on deep peat but intensively farmed, then the emissions that come from those are massively reduced. Maybe not completely eliminated, but massively reduced. But you still have production and still produce food. So at home, there are little bits of those, and there are organisations like ours and some other organisations that are working with landowners and farmers to try and realise ways to bring about financial incentives so that there is a way forward or a roadmap for them to see an economic benefit from managing peatlands in a positive way. But it is slow. I would be completely honest. We're moving in the right direction, but it is a big ship to turn. It's an unbelievably big ship to turn. Yeah.
I don't know what either of you have any thoughts. I'd like to get at least another couple of questions in if we can.
I suppose I have one small thought, which is, certainly I'm seeing signs of hope in terms of transition. I mean, I'm working with the fishing industry in Northern Ireland, and there's a genuine interest in terms of trying to find ways to reduce the impact of the fishing industry on the seabed. And part of that is down to they can see the direction of travel and they can see what's happening. And part of it is down to the economics, is that actually if they can reduce the impact of their nets scraping along the seabed, they reduce the fuel consumption of the boats. And the bottom line is that when oil prices are high, if they can take environmental actions that reduce the fuel consumption on the boats, they will see a net economic benefit from that. The other one thing I wanted to and this is a bit of an aside, is around sanitation. Because I did some work in India a number of years ago, and it's just a sign of human ingenuity that they've developed, some colleagues, Indian scientists have developed toilets with a septic tank in the toilets, that putting in place sanitation for rural schools and rural villages, where the actual septic tank is being used to generate the electricity to then power the village or power the school. So there are signs of people actually taking some of the potential pollution, the waste products, and using that as a tool to then create something new and create renewable energy sources. So there is hope. It's just it's small and it's slow.
Okay. I'd really like to get at least one more question in. I'm just going to...
Poor girl here, got her hand up for a while.
Yes, sorry.
Hi, my name is Vicky Pinkerton. I'm the student governor at Southeastern Regional College. We are very, very eager to advocate for climate awareness. We've just recently launched our first Zero Carbon Centre on our Hollywood campus. We feel that as we're educating the next generation of artists, scientists, business owners, it's vitally important that we make them aware of the climate crisis. Would anyone on the panel have any suggestions? What organisations or websites we could go to for key information on how the younger generation can make both small or large changes?
I know where you're going to point to.
Is that obvious? I mean, we are more than happy to work with anybody in order to raise awareness of the climate crisis and what you can potentially do in order to fight against it. So we have great colleagues that work with youth groups, actually, particularly, and do a lot of community outreach and youth work, bringing them out into the countryside and showcasing what you can do and the benefits and connecting with nature and the issues that we are having and all of that sort of stuff. But we are not alone. There are lots of other organisations. I know the Belfast Hills Partnership in the Belfast Hills does loads of great youth work. The National Trust in the Belfast Hills does loads of great stuff. The RSPB does a lot of really good outreach and stuff as well.
Carbon literacy with Keep an Eye Beautiful and so on. Those
yes,
that's
very good.
Well.
Yes, if you have any budget to do anything, then do that carbon literacy course with Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful, because that is very, very worthwhile.
And AFBI, of course, has a lot of outreach to different student groups and that as well.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, equally our sort of partners at the universities would have potential outreach.
And also come and watch Broken Spectre.
Mm-hmm. And books, Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything.
That's a brilliant book.
Timothy Morton, a bit eccentric, but he's a philosopher, ontology. There's a lot of books as well that the youth tend to want to read, to fill their mind with ideas. Any more?
I hope that's been useful, Vicky. I think we can fit in one more question, and then I'm sorry that we'll have to. There's a lady here has put her hand up just to your. Sorry, there's a lady at the back as well. Sorry.
Hi, sorry, my question's a quick one. Do you think it's possible to do micro rewilding in peatlands? I know that there's rewilding projects across the UK for like beavers and things like that. Do
Do you think it would be a possibility to introduce insect species, promote biodiversity, and do like a small-scale rewilding project?
I mean, rewilding is a much kind of evolved and, I was going to say abused, but that's probably the wrong word, but it's a much evolved word over the past number of years. It's changed drastically from what it first meant. But in my experience, when it comes to peatlands anyway, if you increase the amount of water, then life just comes. It's like if you dig a pond in your garden. I was talking about to somebody the other day, how you can dig a pond, you dig a hole in your garden, and then it fills with rainwater, and within literally about 3 weeks, it'll be full of diving beetles and pond skaters, and you're like, where did they come from? You know, it's not like there's a stream coming into it or anything. You know, they just appear out of thin air. So I have had so many experiences whereby we simply block a drain on a bog, right? And I forget the rest of the bog, but just say block a single drain on the bog, and you get water that rises up behind that dam, right? In that pool of water, within a year, you will now have sphagnum moss colonising it, you will have cotton grass, you will have dragonfly larvae and beetle larvae that are starting to grow in there. Then, in a couple of years, you will have adult dragonflies that are flying around, feeding on pond skaters and diving beetles and everything else that's living above that. And that's just one little bit. I think that even if you have, we would never turn anybody away that just wants to do something, even if it is at a small scale, to work with them and provide them with advice, because if you simply do a small action like that, like simply increase the amount of shallow standing water on an area, you will get life that will just start to come back. I'm a firm believer that, you know, there is a reason that we have to drink liters of this stuff all the time. It is pretty key to biology on this planet. The more of it there is, I think that it's no surprise that we tend to get more wildlife very often, especially in this part of the world. Can you imagine what this place would look like if you blocked every single drain in Ireland? It'd be pretty goddamn wet. So yes, there is scope for doing a lot of that. I think a lot of small-scale rewilding stuff that's being done at the minute is often around, you know, not cutting verges or not cutting areas of amenity grass and stuff, and that's brilliant. But actually, you can do that in a different way in so many different places. If you have like a small bit of wetland in the corner of a building or an industrial centre or a residential area, you can definitely bring in some sort of element of standing water in that part of the world that would be massively beneficial.
And we're back to lots of little actions making up, you know,
big
the
changes.
whole being greater than the sum of its parts. I'm so sorry that we've run out of time. I think it's been a really fascinating 90 minutes, and I'm sure some of us will be around here for a bit longer if anybody wants to chat afterwards. But I would like to offer my thanks to our panel, as I'm sure all of you will. Richard Mosse, conceptual photographer, Billy Hunter from the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute, and Simon Gray from the Ulster Wildlife. I would like to offer my thanks to all of you for coming along this Saturday morning. As I say, I think it's been really interesting. My thanks to Toby and the Belfast Photographic Photo Festival for the invitation to chair the panel. Really enjoyed it, and I hope you've all taken a little inspiration away as well. Also, Carlisle Memorial is just about half a mile up the road that way. 15 minutes will take you there, and you can go and watch Broken Spectre. I highly recommend it. Thank you very much indeed.